Faith is the first factor in life devoted to service. Without faith, nothing is possible. With it, nothing is impossible. Faith in God is the greatest power, but great too is faith in oneself.
The end of the Civil War in 1865 closed 246 years of slavery and oppression for African Americans. What followed was a period called Reconstruction. This was the environment Mary Jane McLeod was born into on July 10, 1875, in Maysville, South Carolina. Her parents were poor, illiterate former slaves who scraped out a living as sharecroppers.
And what happens during this period, blacks are disenfranchised politically, they're segregated socially, economically. It is predicted that they will not survive after slavery because they have no economic base. Out of this, and of course she was born being a black woman, poverty. She had 3 strikes against her right there.
For several years, Mary's parents worked the land for a white landowner until they saved enough to buy property and build their own log cabin. As a young child, Mary worked the fields and picked cotton for up to 10 hours every day with her 16 brothers and sisters. Even with this kind of effort, the struggle just to survive never went away. Eventually, Mary realized that if she didn't find some way to get an education, she'd be doing farm labor the rest of her life.
They worked very hard on their farm. They raised all of their food, preserved it. They were considered, although they lived in a little small cabin, they were considered fairly well off, because if people in the neighborhood did not have food, they could always come to the McLeod's home to get food. They were considered, you know, fairly well off for an African-American family, you know, during the late 19th century, early 20th century.
The battle against oppressive conditions and backbreaking work wore down some African Americans. Others relied on determination and carved their own path to a better way of life. Emma Wilson was one of these pioneers. She started the first school for African American children in Maysville in 1882, and Mary's parents enrolled her as one of the first students. She walked 5 miles every day to Maysville Industrial Institute for classes held in a local church. Mary studied reading, writing, arithmetic, and the Bible. Her thirst for knowledge impressed her first teacher, Miss Wilson. 4 years later, Mary graduated and returned to the farm because there were no more schools for African Americans in her community.
Her mother did laundry for whites in the community. She took her along one day to take the laundry to this wealthy white home. There was a little girl there, and the little girl invited Mary in to play with her toys. Mary saw a book. She picked up the book. The little white girl just snatched the book from her and saying that, no, said, you people can't read. You're not supposed to read. And from that time on, Mary McLeod Bethune said she was determined that she would read, that she would get an education.
Mary took advantage of her education to protect her father from being cheated when he took the cotton to the gin. Often she corrected mistakes made by the person who weighed the cotton. She realized that her father and other farmers probably had been swindled many times. Miss Wilson's school drew media coverage, and articles appeared in the publications of the Presbyterian Board of Missions. A teacher in Denver, Colorado, read a story and contacted Miss Wilson to offer a scholarship to a student. Mary won the scholarship and moved to Concord, North Carolina in the fall of 1887 to attend Scotia Seminary. Soon after she started classes, her family's only mule died and caused major financial hardship. When it happened, Mary was working on different cleaning jobs around school to pay for room and board. This tragedy meant her parents wouldn't be able to pay for her trip home. During the summer months, when school was in recess, Mary worked as a household servant for families in Pennsylvania and Virginia. At Scotia, Mary was intrigued by her Bible courses and decided on a career as a church missionary. She performed well in her classes, and her favorite subject was English. In 1892, nearly 5 years after the farming tragedy, Mary saved enough to go home. As graduation approached, Mary made a decision to apply to Bible school. After 7 years at Scotia, she received a scholarship to an institution in the Midwest. At Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, she was the only African-American student among about 1,000 whites. A major part of her training involved aiding the homeless by preparing meals and counseling tenants in the poor South Side ghetto. In her senior year, Mary's dedication to her studies was rewarded when she was selected to travel with other students in the North and Midwest to open Sunday schools. As final exams and graduation neared, she received bad news. Her family's farm had been destroyed in a fire. Mary sent all of her small savings to help out. When she received her diploma in 1895, she planned a trip to New York City to meet with the Presbyterian Board of Missions. When they told her African Americans weren't allowed to be missionaries in Africa, it was a huge disappointment. She went home and eventually was hired at her old school. The next year, she accepted a teaching position at Haynes Normal and Industrial Institute and moved to Augusta, Georgia. Lucy Laney had founded this school in 1895 in a church basement for African American children. The Presbyterian Board of Missions paid for the first classroom building. While working with Miss Laney, Mary began to think about starting a school. 2 years later, the Presbyterian Mission Board transferred Mary to Kendall Institute. From her new home in Sumter, South Carolina, Mary sent her pay home for 2 younger sisters' tuition at Scotia. And to help her parents, in exchange, she was sent food from home. Mary stayed active by joining the choir of the local Presbyterian church. During a rehearsal, she met a teacher and they started dating. In May of 1898, she married Albertus Bethune and they moved to Savannah, Georgia. Both found teaching jobs, but Mary quit hers after several months when she became pregnant. The next year, on February 3rd, she gave birth to a son, Albertus McLeod Bethune. By 1904, news reached Savannah that the Florida East Coast Railway was building a railroad throughout the state. This meant plenty of new jobs. Bethune also saw this as an opportunity to open a new school for families moving to the region. She felt funding could come from wealthy winter residents in Daytona Beach. When Mary and her family arrived in Daytona, they came to a city divided racially. African Americans lived apart from whites in the worst section. This was where Bethune wanted her school.
But she did have a goal in mind. And her goal was that she was going to teach African American girls. She was going to educate them. And she decided on her goal and she pursued it, even with the situation occurring, even with the lynchings during that period. Because during that period, 1 black was being lynched a week. That's 4 a month. And almost over 200 blacks being lynched a year in the South. 75% of all the lynchings in America were of African Americans. So during this period, she goes to the deep, she arrives in the Deep South and decides, I'm going to start a school for African American girls.